I wasn't in a good place that January, and that sentence was cleaner than the truth. The truth was, I had become a man who could measure a fence line to the inch in blowing snow, but couldn't remember whether he had eaten that day. My wife, Lila, had died the previous winter after a short fight with a long name, and I had spent the spring and summer pretending work was a substitute for breath. By fall, even that stopped holding. I sold off most of my contract jobs, kept only emergency repairs, and moved back to my father's old homestead above Cedar Run because it was paid for and quiet. And I thought quiet was what grief needed. Quiet turned out to be heavy. It sat in doorways and on the edge of the bed and in the chair by the wood stove where Lila used to tuck her feet under a blanket and read aloud weather reports like they were bedtime stories. The house itself was sound enough. Pine plank floors, a long mud room, a hand pump backup at the sink, a stove that drew hard when the wind came from the north. I fixed what needed fixing because that was what my hands knew. I rehung the sagging gate, replaced 3 cracked panes in the west room, patched the barn roof where a limb had punched through. None of it reached the part of me that had gone dark. My name is Ray Harmon. I was 48 that winter, and I had spent 26 years building and repairing fence across 2 counties. Barbed wire, woven wire, split rail if someone had money and patience. I could sink a brace post in frozen ground with a digging bar and stubborn language, and I trusted things you could verify: grade, load, thaw, depth, wind direction. Folks around Cedar Run knew me as practical to the point of dull, which I considered a compliment. I had never been the kind of man to chase stories around a diner table. If a thing mattered, it left tracks. The ridge road to my place curled above the valley in 2 switchbacks and a long gravel stretch that drifted in every storm. My father used to call that weather lane character building. I called it maintenance. The mailbox sat by the county road, and from there my driveway climbed a half-mile through cedar and spruce before opening to the house and lower pasture. In clear weather, it was pretty country. In January, under the North Fork grind, it became a daily argument between man and snow. People outside these hills think a storm is an event. Here, in a winter like that one, it was a system that settled over you and kept pressing. Snow, then sleet, then wind that shaved drifts off one field and stacked them shoulder-high across the next. Then a brittle cold that locked everything in place. Then another round before you had caught up. We called it the grind because it wore down hinges, batteries, tempers, and sometimes the thin places in a person's mind. By the second week of January, I'd started sleeping in my thermals beside the phone and truck keys, so I could move fast when weather windows opened. The only steady human voice in that stretch of time belonged to June Talbot. June lived at the bottom of my ridge in a white 1-story house with a narrow porch and a long gravel drive that always seemed longer when I was carrying something heavy. She was a retired school secretary, widow for near 20 years, and the kind of person who remembered who had a bad knee, who needed low-salt broth, who pretended to be fine and wasn't. She had known my parents, attended my wedding, and sent a card every year with handwriting neat enough to pass for print. After Lila died, June started leaving soup on my porch in old mason jars with blue tape labels. Chicken, beef barley, vegetable. No speeches. Just food and a note that said, "Heat this till steaming and sit down while you do it." I tried to pay her back with practical things: split wood, fixed downspouts, a new latch on her storm door, a rebuilt porch step where rot had started. She let me do those jobs and then tucked envelopes in my coat pocket when I wasn't looking. I would give them back. She would do it again next week. We settled into a truce where I accepted 1 jar of soup if she accepted one armload of oak. In early December, she stood in my mudroom shaking snow from her hat and said, "Ray, grief will make you forget ordinary maintenance. Bodies need feeding same as stoves need wood." I told her she sounded like a school memo. She said, "That's because memos work," and handed me cornbread wrapped in foil. Our longest talk that month happened on a grey afternoon when freezing drizzle turned the porch boards slick as glass. I had brought her 2 sacks of pellets for her emergency heater, and she caught me staring at the framed photo of her husband by the hall mirror. "He's still the first person I talk to in the morning," she said, following my eyes. "Not because I'm confused, because habit is another word for love." I stood there with my gloves in my hand, feeling clumsy and too large for her kitchen. I keep waiting for that part to stop hurting. "It doesn't stop," she said. "It changes shape. Early on it's a wall, later it's weather. I'm not handling it very well. You're here, you're working, and you brought me heater pellets in freezing rain. I'd call that handling." I gave a short laugh. My standards have fallen. Last week I congratulated myself for eating crackers over the sink. "Progress," she said, pointing a spoon at me. "Next week, bowl and chair." That was June. Firm without drama, kind without making you feel small. Right after New Year's, she developed a cough that sounded deep enough to worry me. She brushed it off for 3 days, then let the clinic nurse check her. Pneumonia. Not severe at first, but serious enough they put her on antibiotics, ordered rest, and arranged home follow-up because the roads were unreliable and the waiting room was full of folks sharing whatever they had. The nurse, a steady young man named Eli with a beard that caught snowflakes, told me in the driveway, "Main thing is access. If her oxygen dips, we need to get in fast. Keep this drive open if you can." If you can. That phrase sat hard in my chest. June's driveway ran from County Road to porch in a long, shallow S, flanked by low stone borders and 2 old sugar maples that funneled drifting snow across the bend. A bad night could fill it waist deep. My own lane already took most of my daylight to keep passable with a tired pickup and a homemade plough that rattled loose bolts every other run. I started dividing days into loops. Clear my place, haul wood, check June, run for prescriptions, salt the grade, back home to shovel and stoke, then repeat when the next squall came through. I told myself this was logistics, not fear, but fear was in it. Not mystical fear, ordinary fear with a clipboard and a weather map. I lay awake hearing wind strike the north wall and doing mental math I couldn't turn off. Drift depth at the upper switchback, fuel left in the jerry can. How long a battery backup might last if power dropped. How quickly a nurse could chain up at the bottom of June's drive. I wanted one good, controllable thing in a season that kept moving the goalposts. If I could keep that road open, I could do one useful thing for someone who had done 10 useful things for me. 3 days after her diagnosis, I found her on the porch in a blanket, pale but alert, stubbornly watering a pot of rosemary she kept by the rail like it was July instead of 18 degrees. I took the watering can from her hand and said she was grounded from outdoor gardening until spring. "Bossy," she murmured, then coughed into a tissue. "You bringing me the evening paper?" "I brought paper, broth, and those little crackers you like." She nodded toward the yard. "Then bring yourself in for 10 minutes. You look like a man trying to outwork grief and weather at the same time." Maybe I am. Well, that strategy has mixed reviews. Inside, she ate half a bowl while I checked her thermometer and wrote times on a notepad because she asked me to keep track. We talked about ordinary things on purpose. Whether the county would budget for road salt before March, whether her nephew would make it up from Knoxville when the roads eased, whether my father's old tractor might still run if I swore at it politely. When I stood to leave, she touched my sleeve and said, Don't disappear up that ridge, Ray. Not this winter. I promised I wouldn't. That evening, the North Fork grind came in hard again. Snow started as fine powder just after dusk, then thickened into heavy flakes under a rising wind. By 10, fence posts along my lower pasture had vanished under smooth white humps, and the cedar windbreak made a low, rushing sound like distant surf. Buck, my old red-tick hound, refused his usual long patrol and stayed near the porch steps, ears up, reading weather the way dogs do. I topped off the woodbox, charged the flashlight batteries, laid out chains for the truck, and marked tomorrow's tasks on the back of an invoice. Clear up a bend, check June, deliver medicine, scrape porch, refill stove. Near midnight the power blinked twice and held. I sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and listened to the storm lean against the house. The window over the sink had frosted at the edges, turning the outside world into a blurred silver pane. I remember placing my hand against that glass and realizing I had not prayed, not really since Lila's funeral, because prayer had felt like sending mail to a closed office. But I stood there anyway and said, out loud to a dark kitchen, "Let me keep her driveway open. That's all I'm asking." By dawn, the wind had dropped, but the ridge looked erased, every line rounded and buried under fresh weight. I pulled on my coat, stepped onto the porch, and felt that particular tiredness that comes from sleeping in short pieces for too many nights. Buck moved ahead of me toward the truck, then stopped at the edge of the yard and looked downhill through the pines, as if taking attendance. I followed his gaze and saw only drifting light and trees bowed under snow. I gripped the shovel handle, took a breath that stung all the way down, and started toward the drive before the day could close in around us. The first 30 yards fought me like packed cement. The plough blade bit, jumped, and skated sideways where sleet had layered under the powder, and I had to back up 3 times just to open enough room to turn the truck straight. Wind had combed the drifts into long ridges across the lane, smooth on top and dense beneath, the kind that looked soft until a tire hit and stopped dead. I worked in short passes, blade down, reverse, blade up, reverse again, then out with the shovel to cut what the truck couldn't reach near the ditch line. The cold got inside my gloves early. It always did when the snow had that wet grain to it. By the time I reached the first switchback, sweat had soaked my thermal shirt and turned clammy under my coat. My breath came raw in my throat. I leaned on the shovel and looked through the trees toward the valley, where smoke rose in thin grey columns from a handful of chimneys and flattened under low cloud. Everything else was white and still, and stripped down to shape. Fence lines gone, creek bank gone, just contour and weight. That was how grief felt to me that morning. Not sharp, stripped down, heavy and without edges. I set the shovel down and stood there too long, listening to my own pulse in my ears and the soft tick of cooling metal from the truck. I had spent months moving so I would not have to stand still, and the second I stopped, Lila was there in my head, with a clarity that took my knees weak. Her wool socks draped over the chair back, her habit of tapping the mug twice on the counter before she poured coffee, the way she could tell by the sound of sleet against the windows, whether school would close before the radio said a word. I had guarded those details like they were all I had left, then hated myself because remembering hurt and forgetting felt like betrayal. I told myself the day had a list, and lists were mercy. Open my lane, chain up at the county road, drop medicine and broth at June's, salt her bend, check her pulse ox, repeat. But my mind kept sliding sideways. What if the truck gave out? What if Eli had to turn around at the ridge? What if I got stuck halfway and couldn't walk out fast enough? Men like me pretend worry is planning. Some of it is. Some of it is just fear in a work coat. Buck stayed close while I finished the upper curve. Usually he ranged ahead and nosed every cedar clump for rabbit sign, announcing each discovery like a town crier. That morning he moved in a measured arc around the truck, quiet, checking me more than the woods. Once, when I slipped on a patch of crust and caught myself on the blade frame, he pressed his shoulder against my knee for a second, then stepped back as if to say, we had both seen that, and nobody needed to discuss it. I laughed once, thin and foggy in the cold. You're supervising now. He gave me one look that carried every disappointed foreman I'd ever worked under. At mid-morning, the sky brightened just enough to show where the next band of weather sat above the western ridge, a darker smear moving our way. I got my lane passable to the mailbox, not pretty but usable, and rolled down to the county road in low gear with chains clicking. The county plough had come through before dawn, leaving hard berms at each driveway mouth. Mine took 10 minutes to knock down. June's should have taken 20 by itself, maybe more with drift load from those maples. I turned toward her place, already calculating how much daylight I could spend there before I had to climb back up and restoke the stove. Then I rounded the lower bend and slowed to a full stop in the road. June's driveway was open from blacktop to porch, not just tracked through, not a narrow path, but fully cleared in broad, even swaths with crisp edges against untouched snow. The shallow S-curve showed clean and deliberate, and the final stretch near her steps had been flattened and tamped as if someone had gone over it twice to keep footing firm. There were no tire ruts, no chain marks, no chatter pattern from a blade. The snow on either side rose smooth as cut banks. I sat there with the wipers squeaking dry across the windshield and watched my own breath fog the cab. My first thought was county favour, somebody doing an off-route kindness before shift change. Second thought, neighbour with a skid steer. Third thought, maybe I was so tired I had forgotten helping her after midnight and come down twice. That one died immediately. I remembered every minute of the night because I had not slept enough to lose any of them. I pulled in, parked by the porch, and walked the length of the drive to test what my eyes were telling me. The surface was compacted, not scraped to gravel, and it held my boots without punch-through. Along each side, snow had been moved in rounded pushes too wide for any hand shovel. At the porch steps, each tread was cleared and then smoothed, heel-to-toe width, with a margin near the rail where an older person would naturally place a hand and turn. I stood on the bottom step and looked back toward the road. My lane above, visible through gaps in the trees, still looked like a wrestling match. This one looked cared for. June opened the door before I could knock. She had a blanket over her shoulders, knit cap on, cheeks pale but less grey than yesterday. Her cough interrupted her first sentence. "Ray, you're an hour early. I should be asking you that." I stepped inside, stamped my boots, set the sack on her table. "Who cleared your drive?" She blinked at me. "I thought it was you." "No, I just got here." She watched my face for a long second, then turned and looked through her front window at the curve of open gravel. "Well," she said quietly, "then somebody did us a kindness." "Did you hear an engine?" "Not a thing. I was up at 3 and again around 5. Just wind, then hush." She coughed again, softer this time, and added, "I didn't hear scraping. If there was a machine, it didn't sound like one." I checked her temperature and oxygen while we talked. Numbers were better than yesterday by a notch. She finished half the broth while I replaced ash in the stove and brought 2 armloads of wood from the rack. When I stepped back onto the porch, I looked down the drive one more time, trying to make the scene fit a known tool. It refused to fit. By early afternoon, the next squall reached us, a fine, hard snow that moved sideways in a race detail fast. I climbed back to my place, reopened 2 drifts at the first switchback, and spent an hour in the barn splitting kindling because it gave my hands a rhythm my head could follow. Every so often I went to the doorway and looked down slope through the trees, expecting to hear a plough somewhere, any mechanical proof. Nothing. Just snow hiss and the occasional crack of loaded branches easing. Toward dusk, the storm slackened. The woods settled into that deep winter quiet, where sound carries farther but happens less often. I fed Buck, ate standing up over the sink despite June's standing order about bowls and chairs, then gave in and sat for 5 minutes because I could hear her scolding me in my head. After dark, I drove down again with her evening meds and a charged battery bank for her concentrator backup. Her driveway remained clean. On the way back, I stopped at my mailbox to break up the berm the county plough had left on the second pass. Buck jumped out and trotted to the tree line where the pines began, about 20 yards off the road. I expected a bark when he caught scent. Coyotes ran that edge and he never missed a chance to announce it. Instead, he stood still, tail low and swinging easy, ears forward, posture loose. He looked into the trees the way he looked at June when she opened a jar of treats. Patient, attentive, waiting his turn. "Buck," I called softly. "Come on." He glanced back at me, then returned his attention to the pines. No growl, no hackles raised. Just calm. I walked to the mailbox post and saw the arrangement at its base. 3 river stones laid in a clean cross over a spray of wintergreen, bright leaves and red berries against fresh snow. The stones were flat and grey, not from my gravel and not from June's drive. River stones, carried from lower water somewhere under 2 feet of drift. The wintergreen stem was unbroken, set like someone had placed it with careful fingers. Snow around it held no boot prints, no paw marks, no scuffle, only the faint depressions where the stones had been pressed into place. I crouched there long enough for my knees to ache through canvas pants. Cold seeped in through the seams. I touched one stone with a gloved fingertip, then drew my hand back like I had interrupted something private. I am a man who spent his life explaining events with weight, leverage, weather, and human habit. I started doing that right there on the shoulder of County 14. Maybe June's nephew came up early and didn't knock. Maybe kids from town thought they were funny. Maybe a hunter camped the creek and decided to play guardian angel. Each explanation ran 10 feet and stalled. The drive was cleared before dawn in a storm that hid tracks within minutes. No engines heard, no tire signs, no chatter lines. And my dog, old and opinionated and never wrong about intent, stood at the trees with that mild wag like he was keeping company. I remember whispering, "All right then," to nobody visible. Buck finally turned and came to me. He sat by my leg and leaned his shoulder lightly against my boot while we both faced the pines. The woods held their quiet. Not empty quiet, settled quiet. A respectful kind of distance. I lifted the crossed stones and wintergreen together, keeping the pattern intact, and placed them on the passenger seat beside me. I told myself I was preserving evidence the way any practical man would. The truth felt less tidy. It felt like carrying home the first small proof that the world had not gone hard all the way through. When I got back up the ridge, I carried the stones and wintergreen inside with both hands like a plate that might tip if I breathed wrong. Snow squeaked under my boots. Buck followed at my heel, then stopped on the porch and looked back once toward the dark trees before coming in. I set the arrangement on the kitchen table, peeled off my gloves, and stood over it under the yellow light. The leaves were still firm, berries bright, no frost damage, which meant whoever placed them had done it recently and gently. River stones, smooth and flat, each one about the size of my palm. I knew every pile of rock on my place, and those stones were from running water, not a gravel truck. I finally moved them to the windowsill above the sink where morning light would hit them first, then fed the stove and sat down without meaning to. It was the first time in months I had sat at that window and looked out for something besides weather. By dawn, curiosity had crowded grief off the front step of my mind. Not gone, just moved aside for a minute. I drank coffee standing there in wool socks, watching the ridgeline appear in layers as the light came up, and started making a plan the way I would for a fence fault nobody else could find. Measure the edges, mark reference points, check for repeat patterns. If there was a truck, it left some kind of trace. If there were boots, they would show in crosswind drift at the margins. If there was a person carrying a shovel, the effort would sign itself in stops and starts. Snow always told on labour. I spent the morning opening my own lane again because it had drifted shut in 2 places overnight, and then drove down to June's with her meds and a fresh thermos. Her driveway was clear again, same broad sweeps, same smoothed porch steps, same absence of machine marks. I parked by her mailbox and walked the full length slow, crouching now and then to run my hand across the packed surface. The snow had been pushed with force but not scraped harsh. Edges rounded, no gouge lines. At the inside bend where drift usually piled high, the path widened instead of narrowing, as if whoever cleared it thought ahead about turning radius for a vehicle that might need room fast. That detail sat with me. June let me in and pointed to the kettle before I could ask, so I poured us both tea and checked her oxygen. Better again, 1 point at a time. Her voice still rasped, but she had more colour. "You're doing that look," she said, wrapped in her quilt by the stove. "What look?" Forehead folded like county budget time. "What happened?" I glanced toward the window, then back at her. "Drive's clean again. Same as yesterday. No tracks except mine." She held my eyes for a long second. "You think somebody's helping and doesn't want credit?" "I think something is happening on a schedule and I don't understand the mechanics." She smiled tiredly. "That is the most Ray Harmon sentence I've ever heard." I almost smiled back. "I found something by my mailbox last night. 3 riverstones crossed over wintergreen. Set deliberate. Did you bring it in?" I did. "Good. Kindness deserves a dry place." Her answer should have sounded odd. It didn't. It sounded like June, filing the unknown under practical care and moving forward from there. Around noon, while she napped in her chair, I stepped out to her porch and called the county road garage from my flip phone, cupping the receiver against wind hiss. Dispatcher said, "County roads, Marnie." "This is Ray Harmon up Cedar Run Ridge. Quick route question. Did you all run a private pass on Talbot Drive the last 2 dawns?" She tapped keys a while. "No private calls logged there. Unit 12 did County 14 at 4:40 both days. No side entries. Why?" "Driveway's been opened clean before sunrise. Thought maybe one of your operators did a favor." "If they did, it wasn't on our fuel sheet, and those boys don't miss fuel sheets." "Fair enough. Appreciate it. You staying passable up there?" "More or less. Call if you lose access." That settled one explanation and killed another. I didn't call anyone else. I had no appetite for diner talk. By late afternoon, I drove home, dug out my bundle of reflective stakes from fencing jobs, and cut 8 lengths of survey tape in bright orange. I waited until full dusk, then came back down, and set the stakes along June's driveway edges at measured intervals. 2 at the road mouth, 2 at the bend, 2 near the maples, 2 by the porch turn. I stepped each one off from the stone border and wrote the distances in a pocket notebook. 18 inches, 20, 19, 21. If snow moved overnight, I wanted to know how. If something large passed through, I wanted those stakes to show me where it flowed. June watched from her doorway, blanket over her shoulders. "You're conducting science," she said. "I'm conducting stubbornness with tools." That also describes science. I left her with evening meds, topped her wood rack, and climbed home under a sky that had gone clear and mean with cold, stars hard and bright above black cedar silhouettes. Buck rode quiet beside me, nose to the crack in the window, reading scents I couldn't. The next morning, all 8 stakes still stood, tape fluttering. The driveway lay open between them in the same broad lanes, each marker untouched, snow pressed down exactly to, but not over the boundaries like somebody had respected the line once it was set. My notebook stayed open in my left hand while I walked it. Distance to edge changed by less than an inch at every point, even where drift had built overnight along the maples. No blade chatter, no ruts. At the steps, someone had smoothed each tread again, and a light scatter of crushed ash or cinder had been spread on the top landing where melt had glazed to slick. Not road salt, wood ash, sifted fine. I stood there with that notebook and felt my chest loosen in a place that had been knotted for months. Grief had made my world small, all sharp corners and survival loops. This was not that. This was attention, repeated, precise attention to what would keep an old woman safe in winter. I had no category for it, and that bothered me less than it should have. 3 days passed under the same pattern, storm and clearing, and each dawn, June's drive was opened before first light, while mine stayed rough until I fought it into shape. On the 4th day, I found stacked split oak beside June's back door, dry under a scrap of tin roofing, 4 neat rows chest high. I had not delivered it. She hadn't either. The pieces were cut to stove length and split clean, mostly white oak with some cedar kindling on top. No boot prints in the fresh fall except my own by the time I saw it. I checked her shed to make sure nothing was missing. Nothing was. That afternoon, on my way back up, I cut across my lower pasture to check fence tension where a cedar post had leaned. Near the creek break, I heard a calf bawl once, short and offended, then silence. I found one of Morrow's late fall calves standing free by the brush line with a loop of old wire snare lying snapped open in the snow. The wire had caught low around one hind leg but hadn't cut skin. The calf shook itself, trotted a few yards and started nosing at broom sedge like nothing happened. Around it I saw deep, broad impressions that were not hoof and not boot, spaced wide, heel to toe longer than my forearm. In the center lay the snare stake, bent straight from the ground, not ripped wild, just lifted and twisted clean. I took photos on my phone, then pulled the wire and stake out and carried them home. That was evidence too, and evidence needed a place. So I tagged the wire with date and location and hung it in the barn beside old trapline junk I'd collected over the years. That evening I sat at the table with my notes, stones on the sill, wire tag drying by the stove, and let my mind run without stopping it. It went like this. I'm tired, but not confused. I know the shape of shovel work and plough work and hand labour in snow. I know what fear does to perception, and this is not that. I know Buck's body language better than I know most men's moods, and he is calm at that tree line every time. I know June is getting better because access holds, and access holds because something with uncommon strength and uncommon care keeps doing a task no one asked for out loud. If I were telling this at the feed store, I would hear myself and shake my own head. I would say fatigue, rumour, misread tracks. I would ask for proof, then more proof. Fine. Tomorrow I'll get up earlier, Tomorrow I'll stand where the bend opens and watch until first light shows me what my hands can't explain. I was in place by 4:30, parked dark with the truck nosed into a stand of young cedar above June's upper bend. I killed the engine, cracked the window, and listened. The world was that deep pre-dawn blue where snow reflects enough sky to make shapes but not details. Wind had dropped. No engine noise from County 14. No chain clatter. Just an occasional soft thump of snow sliding from loaded boughs and Buck's steady breathing in the passenger seat. He did not whine or pace. He watched the timber downhill, then looked at me once, as if checking whether I planned to behave. Minutes passed, slow and exact. My fingers stiffened even inside gloves. Frost laced the inside corners of the windshield. Then Buck lifted his head, ears forward, tail tapping the seat once. I followed his gaze into the cedar trunks. At first I caught movement only as absence, a shape where there should have been 3 slim trees, and suddenly there were 2. Then it stepped into a narrow lane of lighter snow, and my breath locked. The figure was towering, dark-furred, shoulders wide as a stock gate, carrying an armful of limbs and packed snow against its chest, like a man carrying kindling in from a woodpile. It moved with a deliberate side angle, not toward the house but across the bend, placing each foot with care before shifting weight, clearing and widening the drifted section where vehicles tended to slide. No rush, no display. Work. I opened the truck door without thinking, boots sinking ankle deep. A dry branch snapped under my heel, louder than it should have been in that quiet. The figure paused and turned enough for profile. Heavy brow, long arms, head slightly bowed as if to reduce its own height among branches. Buck hopped down beside me, trotted 2 steps forward, and sat in the snow with a relaxed spine and low wag, like he was waiting while a neighbor finished at the gate. I whispered, "Sorry," into the cold dark, then felt heat rise in my face despite the temperature. A grown man apologizing to something out of every camp story I'd ever dismissed. I shifted my boot and brushed another twig. "Sorry," I said again, softer. And this time I almost laughed at myself right there, half frozen, hat brim iced over, manners switched on in front of a legend. The figure did not retreat. It lowered the armful where drift had built against the inside bank, pressed the snow down in 2 long sweeps of its forearms, and stepped back to check the width as if sighting a line. Then it moved on, angling away from open yard and windows, keeping distance that felt intentional and respectful. I saw no aggression in it, no furtive hunger, no erratic motion. What I saw was strength under restraint, scale paired with gentleness so clear it made my eyes sting. I stayed where I was until it passed beyond the cedar screen toward the lower section of the drive, visible in pieces between trunks, and then gone. Buck remained seated another moment, tail still moving easy, then stood and leaned lightly against my leg. Dawn had just begun to grey the eastern ridge. I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from the sudden collapse of a boundary I had lived inside for 48 years. The biggest being I had ever seen had spent the night doing careful work for a sick widow, and I had watched it choose quiet over recognition and distance over alarm, as if kindness were simply its habit. I stayed there until the cold started biting through the knees of my canvas pants, and the shaking in my hands settled into something steadier. The eastern sky kept lightening, slow as breath, and the shape moved at the lower curve of June's driveway, in and out of cedar trunks. Each pass broad and careful, each turn made wide so the packed path never pinched down where a nurse's tires might slide. It worked like somebody who had studied that drive in all weather and knew exactly where winter tried to take it back. When it reached the stretch closest to June's porch, it did a thing that struck me harder than the first sight of its size. It brushed snow away from the rail posts with the side of one hand, then pressed the top step flat and even, and left a narrow, untouched margin along the right side, where June always set her cane, before shifting weight to the next tread. I had watched her do that for years. Nobody would guess it by chance. I didn't move toward it. I didn't call out. I stood at the edge of the yard and let my breathing find rhythm again while Buck sat beside me like we were both waiting our turn at a gate. The creature finished the top landing, stepped back, and turned enough that the first clean daylight found its face. Dark fur frosted pale at the shoulders, heavy jaw, eyes amber-brown and steady, not fixed on me like a threat, not darting like an animal cornered, just present. A long look, level and calm, as if it had already decided I belonged in that moment and didn't need to be tested. Then it dipped its head once, almost like a working man's acknowledgement from across a field, and moved away through the trees without hurry. I stood there with my mouth open in the cold and felt half foolish, half grateful, and fully changed in a way I couldn't name yet. Buck gave a soft huff, wagged once, and nosed my glove. I scratched behind his ears with numb fingers and said, "All right, we saw what we saw." By mid-morning, after I'd helped June with her meds and put another row of oak by her stove, I told her plain. No setup, no softening. "I saw him," I said, sitting at her kitchen table with my hat in my lap. "Pre-dawn, at the upper bend. 8 foot if he's an inch, maybe more. Clearing your drive by hand, not tearing at it. Shaping it." June held her mug with both hands and watched steam lift between us. Her voice was rough from the cough, but steady. "You look scared and relieved at once." "I'm not scared." I rubbed my thumb over the hat brim, buying a second. I was for maybe one heartbeat. Then I wasn't. Buck wasn't either. That dog sat down like he was in church. She almost smiled, then winced at her chest and coughed into a tissue. Buck is a fair judge of character. I keep trying to make it fit some normal explanation. And does it? No. She nodded like I had handed her weather data. Then maybe your job isn't explaining. Maybe it's paying attention. I leaned back in the chair and looked at her stove, at the kettle ticking faintly on the back burner, at ordinary life continuing while my categories collapsed. "I don't know what the rules are here." "Same rules as always," she said. "Don't panic, don't brag. Say thank you where you can." A truck door thumped outside and we both turned. Eli came up the porch in his insulated coveralls with a med bag in one hand and a pulse ox kit in the other, snow dusting his beard. He stamped his boots and gave me a quick nod. "How's our patient?" "Bossy," June said. "Improving," I added. He checked her lungs, listened long at her back, adjusted her oxygen setting, and wrote notes while I stood by the sink pretending not to hover. When he finished, he glanced out the window toward the immaculate drive and gave a low whistle. "Whoever's doing this pass is saving me 20 minutes and one bad skid every visit," June said. "We're receiving anonymous civic excellence." Eli chuckled. "Tell anonymous civic excellence I owe them pie." I watched his face to see whether I should say anything. What would I say? A giant neighbor with better bedside logistics than county services. I kept my mouth shut. He gave me a spare battery and a printed checklist for warning signs, then pointed a gloved finger at both of us like a school coach. "Hydration, heat, and no heroics on icy steps. That goes for you too, Ray." After he left, I stayed another hour and fixed a loose screw in her storm door closer, then headed upslope with Buck and a head full of questions that no longer felt hostile. The crux had changed. That morning, the strain in me was not whether the creature existed. The strain was whether I could accept care from something I could not explain without reducing it to rumor or spectacle. I had spent a year refusing help that came wrapped in tenderness, because tenderness reminded me what I'd lost. Now, a being built like a fallen spruce was showing me care could arrive without asking permission. I sat that afternoon at my kitchen table with the crossed stones on the sill and let the thought run all the way through. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself fatigue was writing stories on snow. I told myself grief was hungry for patterns. Then I set those sentences beside what I had actually seen. A path widened where ambulances might need to swing. Steps shaped for June's footing. Wood stacked dry at her door. A car freed with restraint instead of force. My dog calm at the edge of timber. I could doubt my interpretation. I couldn't doubt the care. Care leaves geometry. Care repeats. Care costs effort. Whatever he was, he kept paying that cost in the dark, and he did it without taking anything. That night, I went back down before moonrise and stood in open view at the top of June's drive, shovel planted in the packed snow, hands visible at my sides. No hiding in cedar this time. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the stars made the drifts glow faint blue along the stone borders. Buck stood a few yards ahead, tail low and easy. I heard movement first as a measured compression of crust, not the frantic crackle of deer, not the light scratch of fox, but a heavy, controlled cadence that paused between steps, as if each placement was chosen. He came into the open at the far bend, broad shoulders carrying a slab of drifted snow against his forearms, and stopped when he saw me standing there. We stayed that way maybe 10 seconds, maybe a minute. Time stretched thin in the cold. I lifted one hand from my side and touched my chest once, then pointed toward June's porch, not commanding, just naming what mattered. "Thank you," I said into the still air. He watched me, amber eyes reflecting starlight, then turned slightly away from the house and resumed his work, the same unhurried rhythm, no performance, no claim. He wasn't afraid of me. I wasn't afraid of him. We shared a task line and a silence. By the second week of January, that silence had become its own kind of trust. The storm that set the next thing in motion came in as freezing drizzle over old snow, the worst mix for footing. It glazed fence wire and turned the lower pasture into a patchwork of crust and hidden slush where creek seep crossed under drifts. I spent the morning repairing a sagging brace post near the east boundary and cussing at frozen staples that bent instead of biting. Buck ranged wider than usual, nose low, then doubled back every few minutes to check on me, like I was the one likely to wander off. Near noon, I loaded 2 sacks of feed and a tote of split cedar in the truck bed for June. Her appetite was coming back, and she'd asked for toast and eggs instead of broth, which felt like a victory worth celebrating. I got halfway down my own lane before the rear tires lost grip on clear-looking ice and slid me sideways toward the ditch. I corrected, eased off, caught it, and parked to chain up. While I knelt in wet gravel wrestling chain links with stiff fingers, Buck trotted down the bank toward the old culvert line where meltwater tunneled under the roadbed. "Stay up," I called without looking. "Ice is rotten there." He paused, looked back, then took 2 more steps and vanished chest deep with a sharp splash and a startled yelp that snapped my spine straight. I dropped the chain and ran downslope. Snow crust broke under my boots and dumped me to mid-shin in slush, over black water moving under a skin of ice. Buck scrabbled against the edge, front paws on crust that kept shearing away. He wasn't far, maybe 8 feet, but every step I took toward him cracked more surface. I got onto my knees to spread weight and reached with the shovel handle I'd grabbed from the truck. He caught it once with his paws, slipped, and yelped again, high and scared in a way I had not heard since he was a pup. "Easy, boy. Easy. I got you." My voice shook. "Hold." The bank above me compressed with a deep, dull crunch. I twisted and looked up. He was there at the edge of the ditch, close enough for me to see ice beads clinging to fur on his forearms, breath rising white in slow plumes. He did not lunge. He did not crowd me. He knelt one massive knee into the snowpack, reached down past my shoulder with a hand big as a grain scoop, and set that hand under Buck's chest and ribcage as gently as I would lift a newborn calf. One smooth motion, up and back. Buck came free, water streaming from his coat, and landed beside me on solid crust, trembling but upright. I froze in place, one knee in slush, shovel handle across my palms, while Buck pressed against my side and panted hard. The creature held his position another second, looking from the dog to me, checking, then shifted his weight and used both hands to collapse the weak overhang above the culvert so no one would step there by mistake. He pushed snow and broken crust into a visible berm, marking danger clear as a road sign. That was the part that undid me. Not just the rescue, the follow-through. "Thank you," I said, raw and small in my own ears. He looked at me once, then at Buck. Buck, still shaking, gave one cautious wag and lowered his head. Not submissive, just respectful. The creature's shoulders eased. He rose to full height, stepped back from the ditch line to give us room, and turned toward the cedars. He stopped after 3 paces, reached down, and lifted the dropped chain from where it lay half buried near my tire tracks. He carried it to the truck and set it by the front wheel, links coiled so they wouldn't knot, then tapped the fender lightly with 2 knuckles and moved into the trees until dark fur became shadow, and shadow became nothing I could separate from winter woods. I sat in wet snow with my hand on Buck's neck until his breathing slowed. My own eyes were burning and I let them. No speech, no tidy thought, just relief and gratitude, and the hard fact that kindness had reached right into the narrow place where fear had me pinned. When I got to June's house an hour later, late and soaked to the thighs, she took one look at me and said, "What happened?" I toweled Buck by her stove while I told it straight through. Not dramatic, just sequence, details, the way fencemen give statements. She listened without interrupting, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. When I finished, she nodded once and looked towards the window where snow kept feathering down over her clean drive. "He helped what you love," she said. I swallowed and rubbed Buck's ears. "Yes." "And he made sure you could keep coming down this hill." "Yes." She set her mug down carefully. "Then receive it. People think strength means never needing anyone. That's just another kind of pride." I laughed once, weary and wet and humbled down to the bone. "I'm getting corrected by a woman with pneumonia. You've needed correcting for years." Buck, wrapped in one of June's old towels, gave a sleepy grunt and put his head on my boot. We sat in the stove heat while sleet ticked lightly at the window, and for the first time since Lila died, I didn't feel like the world was a closed system of loss. It felt larger, hard still, winter still, but larger and inhabited by a kind of mercy I had never planned for and could no longer deny. I sat there a long while with Buck's damp weight against my boot and June's stove clicking as the iron expanded and settled, and I understood something I had been dodging since the funeral. I had not just been grieving Lila. I had been bracing for the next loss every hour of every day, as if vigilance could bargain with winter, illness, bad roads, and plain bad luck. I called it preparedness because that sounded respectable. Underneath, It was terror, with a checklist. June watched me over the rim of her mug, not pressing, just staying present the way she always did when words needed room to arrive on their own. Outside her window, sleet stitched diagonal lines through the porch light, and the clean sweep of the driveway glowed pale and steady from road to steps. Inside, Buck finally stopped trembling and let out a deep sigh that seemed to come from somewhere older than his ribs. I looked down at him and then up at June, and my throat closed before I could shape a sentence. I tried anyway. I keep thinking if I stay ahead of it, I can keep people safe. Plow first, chains ready, meds lined up, batteries charged, all of it. I rubbed the heel of my hand over my eyes and felt heat there I could not hide. But it's like bailing a creek with a coffee can. I get one thing handled and 3 more slide loose. June set her mug down and leaned back carefully, one hand to her chest while she caught a breath between coughs. "That is winter on a ridge," she said. "And that is life after you lose somebody you built your days around." I nodded once, hard, and the next words came out torn and too loud for the little kitchen. "I could not lose you too." The room went quiet except for sleet and stove tick. I had not planned to say it. I had not planned to cry either, but once that sentence was in the air, all the held-back pressure from the last year gave way at once. I bent forward, elbows on my knees, hands over my face, and cried like a man who had been trying to stay useful instead of human. Not neat tears, full-body grief and relief tangled together, the kind that leaves you shaking and embarrassed and somehow lighter by a fraction when it passes. Buck pushed his nose under my wrist and licked my knuckles once, then planted himself against my shin as if anchoring me. June reached across the table and rested her hand over my sleeve. Her palm was cool and dry. "Listen to me, Ray," she said, quiet but firm. "You're not failing because you can't control weather. You're loving people in weather. There's a difference." I drew a breath that hitched on the way in. I should have handled this better months ago. Better than what? Her eyebrows lifted. "You showed up. Every day. You brought food when I couldn't stand long enough to stir soup. You checked my numbers, split wood, carried water, fixed that cursed storm door twice. You kept going while your own heart was in pieces. That counts." I gave a short, wet laugh in spite of myself. "You make it sound almost respectable." "It is respectable." She pointed toward Buck with 2 fingers. "And so is accepting help when it comes, even when it comes in a shape you never expected." I sat back and wiped my face with my sleeve like a teenager, then used the towel I'd been drying Buck with because it was cleaner than pride. I told myself, this couldn't be real. That phrase again, the old reflex rising. Then I looked out at that driveway, looked at my dog sleeping against my boot after being lifted out of black water by hands bigger than shovels, and the reflex had nowhere left to stand. By the time the kitchen clock clicked to 4, my breathing had evened out. June ate half a piece of toast with honey and managed a full glass of water without coughing hard. I logged her oxygen reading on the notepad by the kettle, initialed it like Eli asked, and added the battery percentage from the backup pack. Routine steadied me. So did the plain fact that routine was working. When I stood to leave, June touched my forearm again. "You don't owe me strong tonight." I met her eyes. "Then what do I owe?" "Honest." She gave me that school secretary look that had probably straightened out 3 generations of boys. "And rest if you can." "I'll try." Trying is enough. I loaded the empty thermos, checked Buck's paws for ice cuts, and stepped onto the porch with him at my side. The sleet had thinned to fine snow. The sky was going the color of dull tin behind the cedars, and the whole valley looked like it was holding still between breaths. I turned before getting in the truck and looked back at June, framed in the doorway under the porch light, blanket around her shoulders, one hand lifted in a small wave. I lifted mine back and waited until she shut the door. The drive up my ridge took twice as long as usual. Ice had formed under the new dusting, and I crawled in low gear with chains clicking and the wheel tight in my hands. At the culvert where Buck had gone through, I could see the berm the creature had built, clear and deliberate, standing out as a raised pale line along the weak edge. I added 2 reflective stakes from behind my seat, one at each end, and tied orange tape high enough to catch headlights. Evidence, yes. Also, gratitude turned practical. Back home, I stripped out of wet layers in the mudroom, fed Buck an extra scoop, and made myself eat at the table in an actual bowl like June would have demanded. The crossed stones sat on the windowsill above the sink, dark against the snowlight, and I touched them with 2 fingers before washing up. No ritual beyond that, just acknowledgement. Night settled fast. By a little after 7, the ridge had gone fully black, except for my porch lamp, and a narrow wash of moon behind cloud. Wind moved through the spruces in slow pulses. Not a hard blow, more a long exhale that bent the upper branches and let them rise again. Buck finished his water, looked at me, then at the door. "You want one more round?" I said. He thumped his tail once. I put on coat, hat, gloves, and took the shovel mostly from habit. We drove down to the top of June's driveway and parked off to the side where I'd stood before, open and visible. Snow squeaked underfoot, dry and tight with dropping temperatures. The porch light at June's place burned steady through the trees. No engine sounds anywhere, not from County Road, not from neighboring farms. Just the small winter noises. Branch creak, sift of powder slipping from a bough, Buck breathing. I did not hide. I did not call out. I stood with the shovel planted and my hands resting on the handle, and I let the silence be what it was. After a while, movement took shape at the far bend, first as a darker section of dark, then as him, stepping into the open lane with that same measured cadence. Moonlight caught frost along his shoulders and the top of one forearm, silvering the fur. He carried no branch this time, only used his hands and forearms to roll packed snow from the inside edge where the wind had started rebuilding a lip. Each pass was efficient and unhurried, done without looking toward the house windows, done without any hint of display. Buck walked forward 3 paces, stopped, and sat. His tail moved low and even. He looked from me to the creature and back once, then settled his gaze on the work, like he had decided this was simply one more member of a nighttime crew. The creature finished the bend and moved toward the porch stretch, keeping that respectful distance from doors and glass. At the steps he paused, pressed the top landing flat, then scattered another thin sweep of crushed ash where a sheen of ice had formed. I had no idea where he got that ash. He used it sparingly, exactly where a boot would land. Precision again. Care again. When he turned back up the drive, he saw me in full view and stopped. We watched each other across maybe 40 yards of pale snow and cedar shadow. I lifted my hand from the shovel and placed it over my chest. The same gesture as before, then lowered it and pointed once toward June's lighted window. "Thank you," I said, voice carrying small in the cold. He held still another moment. Then he dipped his head once, not dramatic, almost casual, and stepped off the cleared lane toward the trees. He did not hurry. He did not look back to check whether I followed. He moved between 2 thick cedars, broad shoulders narrowing in perspective until branches took him in piece by piece, dark fur to shadow, shadow to distance, distance to ordinary forest. I waited for him to reappear lower down, the way he had on other nights. He didn't. The woods stayed quiet. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Moonlight thinned behind cloud and returned. No heavy footfalls, no fresh work sounds, no sign except the clean drive and the careful steps. Buck stood at last, walked to the place where the lane met the trees, sniffed once, and came back to me without fuss. He leaned his shoulder into my knee. I scratched his neck and felt a calm settle over me that was not joy exactly, not sadness either, something steadier than both. By the 3rd week of January, I had learned that gratitude sometimes arrives and leaves the same way, without asking for witness, without waiting for applause, doing what it came to do, and then giving the night back to itself. I took one slow walk down the full length of June's driveway, checking edges, checking footing, noting where tomorrow's wind might start trouble. At the porch steps, I brushed away a little loose powder he had missed, or ignored, then smiled at myself for the thought. Missed was unlikely. Left for me on purpose felt closer to truth, a final inch of work so I could still be part of the keeping. June cracked the door when she heard my boots and called softly, "You all right out there?" I looked up at her, porch light warm on her face, and nodded. "Yes, ma'am, drive's good." She studied me a second, then gave a small, knowing tilt of her head. "Different kind of quiet tonight." "Yeah," I said. "It is." I waited until she latched the door, then headed back up the ridge with Buck curled on the truck seat and the shovel rattling gently in back, carrying grief, relief, and a new understanding that did not need explanation to be true. The next morning broke clear and brittle, the kind of cold that made every board in June's porch complain when I stepped on it. Her driveway was open again, but lighter snow had fallen after the clearing, a thin powder over a hard-packed base. And for the first time in days I could see the outline of each broad print at the edge where the drift met the lane. They kept that same respectful distance from her windows and door, crossing the yard only where work required it, then returning to timber. Nothing prowling, nothing restless, just a route. Eli's truck was already there, nose toward the road for a fast exit if weather turned. He met me at the kitchen table with his stethoscope looped around his neck and a grin he tried to hide. "She's turning the corner," he said quietly. "Lung sounds are better. Oxygen demand's down. Fever gone since last night." June, wrapped in her quilt and annoyed at being discussed like a weather system, lifted her mug. "I can hear you both perfectly well." Eli laughed. "Good, then hear this too. If numbers hold through the weekend, we can space visits farther apart." I watched relief move through her shoulders and settle. It moved through me too, slower, like thaw under old ice. Eli finished his charting, then looked out the window at the drive and gave me a sideways glance that asked a question without words. On the porch, while he zipped his coat, he spoke low. "I don't need details you don't want to give. But I saw tracks by the bend this morning. Bigger than snowshoes, bigger than anything sensible. Whatever's been helping up here, I'm not filing that in a medical note." I studied his face, waiting for a joke. None came. He shrugged. "My granddad used to say these hills have neighbors we don't vote for and don't own. He said good manners travel farther than certainty." He opened his truck door, then paused. "You and June are safe. That's what I care about." That was the nearest anyone came to naming it, besides me. He never brought it up again. By the end of that week, I drove into town with 2 jobs in mind. Settle the snare issue and call back the county garage the way I should have after that first dispatch question. I took the tagged wire and bent stake from my barn, set them in the truck bed, and went straight to the wildlife office behind the feed mill. Warden Pike, who had known my father and still wore a canvas coat shiny at the elbows, met me at the counter. Found this near my lower pasture, I said. Calf got caught. No injury, but it could have gone bad fast. He turned the wire in his gloved hands, jaw tightening. Old poacher rig, illegal as it gets. You got location. I handed him a printed map with the spot marked and showed him the phone photos, including the freed calf and the snapped loop. I did not show him the deeper prints nearby. Some evidence belonged to paperwork, some belonged to witness. He bagged the snare and stake, wrote me a receipt, and said, "I'll sweep that creek line this afternoon and pull any others." 3 days later, he called from a bad connection and told me he'd found 2 more old sets, both inactive, both removed. Thread closed. I pinned his receipt above my workbench next to saw, blades, and fence staples, proof that one danger at least had been handled. From the wildlife office, I drove to County Roads and caught Marnie on her lunch break, standing by the salt shed with a foam cup in both hands. "Ray Harmon," I said. "Cedar Run Ridge. I asked about Talbot Drive getting ploughed off book." Her eyes narrowed in recognition. "You the stubborn one with the half-mile lane." "Guilty," she snorted. "No county unit did it. I checked route logs twice after your call. Still nothing. But you sound less panicked than you did." "I am. Access held. June's improving." "Good." She tipped her cup toward me. Then outcome noted. That was all she needed. Practical people sometimes close files with one clean sentence. By the second week of February, June could stand long enough to fuss at me for overstacking her wood too close to the stove, which I took as a medical milestone. The North Fork grind still threw squalls at us, but the intervals lengthened. I started each morning the same way. Coffee at the sink, hand on the crossed river stones, and wintergreen on the sill, one look toward the ridge. Some dawns the drive was already clear when I arrived. Some dawns I reached June's place first and found only a light drift, as if he had chosen to leave that one for me. Either way, the feeling changed from emergency to partnership, then from partnership to gratitude with no expectation attached. One hard freeze overnight left glare ice across June's top step. I came down before sunrise with ash in a bucket, ready to spread it, and found a thin grey dust already laid in a perfect arc where her boot would land. I stood there grinning like a fool in 20-degree air and said, "You beat me to it," to a silent tree line. Buck wagged once as if to confirm the shift schedule. Later that morning, I stopped at Morrow's place to check the calf I'd photographed. It trotted the lot, healthy and rude, and Morrow waved me over from his gate. "Heard you found snare wire by your creek," he said. "Turned it in. Warden pulled more." "Glad for that." He scratched his chin and looked toward my ridge. "Also heard your road's been getting help." I waited. He gave a half smile. "I don't trade in stories, but my grandmama left apples at the edge of timber every first snow, and she wasn't a foolish woman." It was another almost confession that never became one. I nodded, he nodded, and we talked hay prices instead. Not every loaded look needs translation. Some are simply permission to stop pretending you're alone with what you saw. By late February, the maples along June's drive were dropping meltwater instead of rime, and mud began showing through where gravel had been white for months. June walked to her mailbox with a cane and no oxygen line, slow but steady, while I hovered 5 paces behind, like a nervous deputy. "Ray," she said without turning, "if I fall, you may say I told you so exactly once." "I'll treasure the opportunity." She laughed, then coughed once, light and brief, and kept moving. At the mailbox, she touched the post and looked up the ridge toward my place. "You're different." "So are you." "No, I'm just less sick." She turned, eyes sharp and kind. "You're softer around the edges. Took long enough." I looked past her to the tree line where Buck stood with his nose in the wind, calm as ever. I used to think tenderness made a man easier to break. And now I think refusing tenderness did most of the breaking. She nodded like a teacher hearing the right answer after a stubborn semester. The final morning came without ceremony. A wet snow had fallen overnight, 3 inches maybe, the kind that sticks to cedar bark in thick white ribbons. I drove down expecting to find either his broad passes or my own work waiting. June's driveway lay open from road to porch in one clean, deliberate run, edges smooth, steps brushed, top landing treated with a faint trace of ash. At the base of the porch rail, set just off the packed path, sat a single flat river stone with one wintergreen sprig across it. No prints led away. Sun had already softened the surface where they would have been. I picked up the stone and sprig and held them in my palm until the cold stung. June opened the door behind me and took in the scene without asking questions. "He said goodbye," she said. I swallowed. "Feels that way." She rested her hand on my sleeve. "Then we say thank you and keep living like we meant it when we were afraid." I set that final stone on my kitchen sill beside the first crossed 3. The wintergreen dried there over days, leaves darkening, berries wrinkling, shape intact. I kept it anyway. March brought alternating thaw and slush storms, the ugliest kind for older folks on steep drives. One evening, after pulling my father's old plough frame out of the barn for the 3rd time and cursing at a seized pivot pin, I stopped cursing and rebuilt it right. New hydraulic line from the farm supply in town, rewired lights, reinforced angle braces, fresh cutting edge. Took me 2 full Saturdays and 1 set of knuckles barked open on rusty bolts. When it ran true, I drove the ridge and cleared not just my lane and June's, but the Bakers, old Mr. Keen's, and the little rental where the Ortiz brothers worked night shift and slept through snowfall alarms. I started keeping a handwritten list on the dash. Who needed medicine picked up, who needed steps scraped, who had a dead battery and no sun nearby. At first, people tried to pay me. I shook my head and told them to pass it on where they could. That wasn't sainthood, it was debt, gladly carried. In April, when the last dirty banks shrank into ditches and frogs started up in the low creek after dusk, I took Buck down to the culvert, where he'd gone through. The berm was mostly melted out, stakes leaning, orange tape faded to peach. I pulled the stakes and coiled the tape for reuse, then stood a minute, listening to water move under rock and leaf litter. No sign remained except memory and a dog who still paused there, looked toward the cedars, and then walked on easy. I still can't explain what I saw in terms that fit a manual. I can account for weight, leverage, and effort. I can map the geometry of those cleared paths and the timing of each act of care. I can point to June alive and stubborn on her porch, to a calf that grew through spring without a limp, to a winter where access held when it should have failed. I can also tell you the world did not get smaller after that January, and neither did I. Most mornings now, before coffee, I touch the stones on the sill and look out at weather moving over Cedar Run. Some days are mild, some are hard, and grief still changes shape like June said it would. It comes like weather, then passes, then returns gentler, but it no longer seals every road. I check on people. I sit to eat. I answer the phone when someone needs a hand, and when snow starts down in thick, quiet bands, I clear June's drive first, smoothing the porch steps heel to toe, leaving a narrow margin by the rail where her cane lands, the way kindness was once shown to us in the dark.